The winter of 1887 came down hard on the Bitterroot Valley, and it did not leave quietly. It left the way all hard things leave in that country, slowly releasing its grip one creek at a time, one frozen wheel rut at a time, with a sound like slow breathing in the pines. What it left behind, when the last of the snow pulled back from the lower meadows and the mud began to show its old brown face, was more than most people expected to find. Certainly more than anyone expected to find in a collapsed wagon that had been locked in the ice of Granger Creek since the autumn of 1871. Nora Hale was 27 years old when she purchased the wreck. She had $11 in a tobacco pouch, a surveyor's leather satchel that had belonged to her uncle, and a set of brass-fitted calipers she carried everywhere she went. She did not purchase the wagon on impulse or desperation. Though the men at the auction believed it was one or the other, she purchased it because she had measured the frame with her eye from 30 yards away and knew something about what a wagon bench that wide was built to conceal. If you have ever stood at the edge of a thing, other people walked past and thought that there was more there than they were seeing, then you already understand something about what she was doing at Granger Creek that April morning when the ice began to pull back and show what it had been holding for 16 years. Stay close to this story. The wagon had come to rest in the creek in the autumn of 1871 under circumstances that were well remembered in Stevensville and very poorly understood. A freighter named Calvert Morse had been transporting cargo for the Bitterroot Land and Cattle Company, and the records at the county office showed the load as dry goods and seed stock. Morse had drowned when the wagon tipped crossing the creek in high water. The company had paid to have the body recovered. The wagon, they said, was not worth retrieving. The creek had taken it into its grip over the following winters, ice building up around the wheels and the running gear, until by 1875 the whole wreck sat encased in a layered shell that expanded and contracted with each season, but never fully released. It had become part of the landscape, a frozen dark mass in the bend of the creek, willows growing up around it, the wood above the waterline going gray and cracked, while the submerged portions stayed sealed against the cold. People in Stevensville had various ways of accounting for why the company had not tried to recover the wagon. Some said the load was a loss regardless and the freight was not worth the effort. Some said the company had its reasons for wanting the thing to stay where it was. By the end of the 16th year, the wreck had simply stopped being thought about at all. A frozen wreck in a creek bend becomes ordinary quickly. It becomes part of the view, a landmark even, the kind of thing you point out to a newcomer without explaining it, because the explanation requires more history than most people want to carry. Nora had heard the story first from her uncle, Randall Hale, who had served as an independent surveyor for the county for 22 years. Before his lungs gave out in the winter of 1883, he had measured and mapped and recorded almost every parcel of land in the valley, and he had understood very early what the Bitterroot Land and Cattle Company was doing to the small homestead claims along the creek drainage. He had been hired by the company early on, a contract that seemed reasonable and proved useful to him in ways the company had not intended, giving him access to the original homestead claims before the company acquired them, which meant he was one of the few people in the valley who had measured the ground both before and after the company's paperwork moved through the county office. He did not have proof of wrongdoing. He had suspicion and a surveyor's trained instinct that the measurements on the recorded plats did not match the measurements on the ground, but suspicion was not evidence, and his word against the company's was not a case any territorial court would hear. He had filed his private concerns with the county recorder once, early, and the recorder at the time had received his notes with the kind of careful neutrality that meant the notes would go into a drawer and stay there. He had understood then that the mechanism of official record was not going to be the thing that corrected the record. He had continued his work. He had continued measuring. He had told Nora about the wagon once, near the end, when his voice had gone thin and he could only talk for short stretches before the coughing took over. She had been sitting beside his bed in the house on Warden Street where he had lived alone since her aunt died, and the afternoon light was coming through the window at a low angle and falling across the quilt and the shelf of survey instruments he kept on the wall above the bed as if they were ornaments, which they were not. He kept them there because they were the things he valued most, and a man who knows he is running out of time keeps what he values where he can see it. He said that Calvert Morse had not been carrying seed stock. He said that Morse had been a careful man, more careful than the company gave him credit for, and that careful men sometimes built things into their equipment that an inventory would never show. He did not know what Morse had hidden or whether anything had survived 16 years of water and ice. He only knew what the wagon bench had looked like the one time he had ridden on it, the year before the accident, and how its proportions had struck him as a man who spent his life measuring things. The bench had been 3 inches deeper than it needed to be. Nora remembered that detail the way she remembered everything her uncle told her, precisely without ornament, with the knowledge that he did not waste words on things that did not matter. She had filed it in the way she filed all his observations, as fact of uncertain application that might someday locate the thing it applied to. She had not thought of it for 4 years. Then she had come back to Stevensville to close out his estate, and she had spent 2 days in the county record room, and on the second day she had found the discrepancies in the Bitterroot Land and Cattle Company plat filings that her uncle had never been able to get anyone to look at. And she had thought of the wagon. She had walked to Granger Creek that afternoon in March, when the ice was still thick and the wagon still fully encased. She had stood on the bank and looked at it for a long time. The bench was visible above the ice line, tilted but intact, the gray timber catching the last cold light of the afternoon. She could not measure it precisely from the bank. She could measure it with her eye, and her eye said what it said, and she trusted her eye. She had gone back to town and waited for the auction. The auction for salvage rights on the Granger Creek wagon came up in the second week of April, listed on a single sheet at the Stevensville land office between a notice about unclaimed mail and a notice about a stray mule. The Bitterroot Land and Cattle Company had dissolved in 1879, under circumstances the county newspaper had reported as voluntary reorganization, and which anyone with a memory knew was the consequence of bad debt and a federal inquiry that had gone nowhere. The wagon was now technically county property, and the county was selling whatever salvage value a man might find in rotting wood and rusted iron. Nora was the only woman at the auction. There were 4 men, one of whom was a blacksmith named Fenwick, who wanted the iron hardware if the fittings proved salvageable, and one of whom was a rancher named Doss, who seemed to believe the wagon's lumber might still be usable if enough of it had stayed above the waterline, and 2 whose interest she could not determine, and who did not bid seriously. The auctioneer, a thin man named Corder, had already made the joke twice that whoever bought the wagon would need a miracle and a warm April to get it out of the ice before summer. He made it a third time when Nora stepped up. She paid $6. The blacksmith bid $4. She went to $6 and did not hesitate. Corder wrote out the receipt with the same expression he might have worn, writing a receipt for a bag of wet sand. She folded it into her satchel without reading it. Fenwick caught up with her on the steps outside and asked if she was planning to salvage the iron hardware herself, because if not, he would pay her a fair price for the fittings. She told him she would let him know. He looked at her the way men looked at her when they were trying to determine what she knew that they did not, which was a look she had learned to receive without acknowledgement. The thaw that year came on a Tuesday, steady and warm, the kind of April day in the Bitterroot that smells like pine sap and cold mud, And something behind both of those things that has no name, but that anyone who has worked that land knows, is the smell of winter releasing its hold. Nora had been camped at the creek bend for 3 days by then, waiting. She had a fire, a bedroll, a cast iron pan, and her uncle's surveying kit. She had spent the first 2 days measuring what she could see of the wagon above the ice line and taking notes in her field book. The bench seat was the highest point of the surviving structure. The frame had collapsed on the right side when the wagon tipped, the box tilted at an angle toward the bank, but the driver's bench had been built of heavier timber than the rest of the wagon, and it had held. It sat at a tilt, gray and cracked on top from 16 seasons of sun and dry air, but structurally intact. Below the ice line, when she probed with a long stick on the second afternoon, the submerged frame felt solid. The cold had preserved what the wet might otherwise have taken. The dimensions of the bench, as best she could measure from outside the ice shell, were consistent with what her uncle had described. She set the calipers against the visible end of the bench and read the measurement twice, and wrote it in her field book. 3 inches deeper than a bench of that width needed to be. Not 3 inches of slop in the carpentry. 3 inches of deliberate concealment in the design. Her uncle had been right. She had known he would be. On Tuesday morning, the ice began to crack. Not dramatically, not with any single loud report, but in the gradual settling way that ice cracks when the water underneath begins to move again and the structure above it loses its purchase. She heard it before she saw it, a low, intermittent tick like a clock that had been stopped for years and was considering whether to start again. By mid-morning, the upper layer around the wheels had separated, and water was running freely beneath. By early afternoon, the bench was accessible. She had brought a short-handled adze, a steel pry bar, and her calipers. She waded in to her knees, the cold taking her breath for a moment, and then becoming simply a condition she was working inside. The water of Granger Creek in April runs off snowmelt, and it is not gentle about it, carrying grit and broken ice chips and moving faster than the surface suggests. She moved carefully, one hand on the tilted frame for balance, her boots finding purchase on the creek stones beneath the mud, until she was standing alongside the bench. The wood on the underside of the seat had been in or near the water for 16 years, but the bench itself was high-sided, almost a box in its construction, and the water level in the creek rarely rose above the bench bottom, except in the highest spring floods. The underside showed the marks of water and ice, dark staining and a faint bloom of mineral deposit at the lowest edge, but had not rotted through. The builder had used dense timber, probably white oak, and had set it with something that had held against repeated cycles of wet and dry. She ran her hand along the edge of the seat plank and found the seam her uncle had told her to look for, without knowing he was telling her anything specific. A fine line in the wood that followed the grain so closely it looked like a natural feature of the timber and was not. A drawer, built into the body of the bench, flush with the grain, with no visible hardware on the outside face. The join was tight enough that water had not worked its way in at the seam. The builder had fitted it with the care of a man who intended it to last. She took the pry bar and worked the seam with the flat edge, not forcing it, reading the resistance the way her uncle had taught her to read the resistance of a lock or a stuck survey marker, understanding that a thing built to be hidden is built differently from a thing built to be opened, and that the difference is in where the maker put the tension. She found the tension point on the third pass with the bar, applied pressure at the correct angle, and the drawer slid open 3 inches on a wooden track that had swelled slightly with moisture but had not seized. The cold inside the drawer was different from the cold of the creek. It was a sealed cold, the cold of air that had been contained since the autumn of 1871, and it carried with it the smell of old paper and something faintly metallic, the smell of a thing that had been kept against the intention of time. She did not reach in immediately. She looked first, in the manner of a surveyor who has learned that what you see before you touch is information you cannot recover once you have disturbed it. The creek moved past her knees. A kingfisher crossed the water upstream and did not slow. Inside the drawer, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone dark and stiff with age, but had not failed, were a set of papers. The oilcloth had been folded over them multiple times and tied at each end with waxed cord. Whoever had packed them had not been in a hurry and had not assumed the hiding would be brief. She lifted them out with both hands, holding them against her chest to keep them out of the water, and carried them to the bank. Her hands were numb from the creek. She sat down on a flat rock above the waterline and set the oilcloth parcel on her knee and untied the cord ends slowly, because the cord was brittle and she did not want to tear what was beneath. Each layer of oilcloth released a different quality of cold as she unwrapped it, the outermost still carrying the smell of creek water, the middle layers drier and darker, the innermost almost odorless except for the paper smell and the faint metal smell that grew stronger as she approached the documents themselves. The innermost layer came away, and she was holding a sheaf of folded papers that crackled faintly at the edges, but had not pulped, had not fused, had not lost their ink to moisture. 16 years in a sealed drawer, wrapped in oilcloth, above the waterline in a mountain creek. Calvert Morse had known exactly what he was doing, and he had done it well. The top document was a set of survey plats, not the plats that were on file at the county office, which she had spent 2 days reading the previous week and had by now largely memorized. These were a parallel set, marked in a different hand, recording different measurements. Her uncle's hand, his careful block numerals and his habit of underlining the final figure in each measurement, a practice she had always thought of as his signature, even before she knew it was his alone. His formal signature was at the bottom of each sheet, and the dates ran from 1868 to 1871. The last one dated 6 weeks before Morse drowned. She understood what she was looking at before she finished reading the second page. Her uncle had taken private measurements of the homestead claims along the Granger Creek drainage, every claim that the Bitterroot Land and Cattle Company had acquired in the decade between 1862 and 1872, and he had compared those measurements against the plats the company had filed with the Territorial Land Office. The discrepancies were not small, and they were not random. Parcel after parcel had been recorded at dimensions smaller than their actual survey measurements, shaving acreage in increments modest enough to escape casual notice and substantial enough across 37 separate claims to represent a transfer of land from the original homesteaders to the company, accomplished entirely on paper, without a single deed being contested or a single boundary stone being moved. The company had not needed to move the stones. They had simply filed false plats and relied on the fact that most homesteaders in 1865 could not read a survey and would not know to ask whether the recorded dimensions matched the measurements on the ground. The land office had received the filings and stamped them and put them in order because the land office did not verify survey measurements against independent fieldwork and had no particular reason to do so when the surveyor whose measurements were cited was a respected man in the territory who had no known interest in the outcome, except that her uncle's measurements were not the measurements the company had filed. Someone between the surveyor and the land office had altered the figures. The plats on file at the county office showed her uncle's signature above numbers that were not her uncle's numbers. She sat on the rock for a long time, reading each document through twice, the cold working its way back into her hands and she not minding it. There was a list at the back of the sheaf in a different hand from her uncle's, in the plain, direct script she imagined Morse would have written. It listed the names of the original claim holders, 37 families, and beside each name a notation of the acreage discrepancy and a calculated figure in dollars at what the company had paid per acre when it acquired each claim. The dollar figures were modest. The acreage discrepancies taken together were not. The last page in the sheaf was a letter, unsigned, addressed to the county recorder's office in Stevensville. It was written in her uncle's hand, and it read as a formal filing of corrected survey measurements, citing each parcel by its assigned number, each discrepancy by acreage, with a request that the corrected plats be entered into the public record and the matter referred to the Territorial Land Court in Missoula for further review. It had never been delivered. Morse had been carrying it to Stevensville, along with the survey documents that would support it, and the creek had taken him before he arrived. The letter had been waiting in a bench drawer at the bottom of Granger Creek for 16 years, waiting for the right spring and the right hands. Nora refolded the documents into the oilcloth, tied the cord ends as firmly as their age allowed, and placed the parcel inside her uncle's leather satchel. She walked back to her camp and built the fire up. She made coffee and drank it standing, looking at the wagon that now sat half clear of the ice, its tilted frame dark against the greening willows, the open drawer still visible from the bank, like a small square mouth that had said everything it had been holding back. She thought about her uncle in the house on Warden Street, watching the last afternoon come through the window and running out of time to say the things he had needed to say for 4 years. She thought about what it costs a careful man to know a thing he cannot prove, and to carry it for years, and to die with it still unproven. She thought about Calvert Morse on the crossing at Granger Creek in October of 1871, the water high and moving fast and the oilcloth parcel under the bench, and what it means to do the right thing carefully, when you already know the water is not going to wait. If you have ever held something someone kept for you without knowing they were keeping it, you understand what that fire tasted like. Tell me in the comments whether you have ever found something that should not have survived the years it waited. She spent that evening making a clean copy of each document in her own survey hand, cross-referencing the plat numbers against the county record she had memorized. The discrepancies held in every case. Every parcel number matched the county office files. Every acreage notation was legible. She dated the clean copy April 1887, Granger Creek, Ravalli County, Montana Territory, and signed it with her full name and her surveyor's certification number, the one the territory had issued her in 1884 after she had passed the examination in Missoula, with a score that the examining officer had described as accurate, and had left at that. In the morning she rode into Stevensville. The county recorder at the time was a deliberate man named Pruitt, who had been in the office for 11 years, and who received unusual filings with a stillness that suggested he had seen most things and had learned not to let them move him too quickly. He had known her uncle, had worked with him on a dozen ordinary filings over the years. He received Nora with the same stillness. She placed the oilcloth parcel on his counter and the clean copy beside it, and explained in plain language what they were, where they had come from, and what she believed they showed. She did not use the word fraud. She named the discrepancies and let the numbers carry the weight. Pruitt did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the documents, the original plats and the letter and the parcel list, and then at her clean copy, and then back at the originals. He picked up the parcel list and read it through slowly, the way a man reads a list of names he half recognizes and is deciding whether he recognizes them all. "These are original survey measurements," he said, "in your uncle's hand." "They are," she said. "I know who Randall Hale was," Pruitt said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite grief and not quite respect, but held elements of both. He set the list down on the counter between them and looked at her steadily. "Where have these been?" "In the Granger Creek wagon," she said. "Under the bench." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who is deciding whether a statement is credible and then deciding that the woman delivering it has no reason to manufacture it when the alternative is simpler. He sent a clerk for the county's original Bitterroot Land and Cattle Company parcel files before she had finished settling her satchel on her shoulder. The filing took 3 days. Pruitt was methodical, comparing each of the 37 parcels against the company's recorded plats and then against her uncle's measurements, and in each case the discrepancy was present, and in each case it ran in the same direction, the recorded acreage below the surveyed acreage by an amount that was modest per parcel and considerable across the full set. He worked without commentary, asking Nora 2 questions on the first day and 1 on the second and none on the third. On the third day, he filed a formal corrected record for each of the 37 parcels and sent notice to the Territorial Land Court in Missoula. He also sent a letter, at his own initiative, to the Stevensville newspaper. It was a brief letter, formal in its language, reporting that a set of survey documents recovered from the Granger Creek wagon wreck had been filed with the county office, and that corrected plat entries were being made for 37 parcels in the lower creek drainage. He did not characterize the original discrepancies as deliberate. He did not need to. The letter listed the parcel numbers and the magnitude of the corrections, and anyone in the valley who had ever held a deed to one of those parcels would read the list and understand what the corrections meant. The Bitterroot Land and Cattle Company had dissolved 8 years earlier. Its principals had dispersed across the territory and beyond. 2 were dead. 1 had moved to Portland. The remaining interests in the company's former holdings were held by a Helena bank that had received the assets in settlement of an outstanding loan, and the bank received Pruitt's notice with the kind of flat administrative acknowledgement that institutions produce when they are absorbing information whose implications they have not yet determined. The Territorial Land Court took up the matter in the summer of 1887. The original homestead families, most of them now represented by their children or grandchildren, were notified by letter. Some of the families had left the valley entirely. Others were still on or near the original claims, their acreage having passed through several hands or been absorbed into larger ranches without anyone revisiting the original plat dimensions. Locating the correct parties took time, and confirming the chain of title took more time, and the land court in Missoula was not a rapid body even by the standards of territorial courts. But it was a thorough one. Restitution proceedings ran through the autumn of 1887 and into the following spring, parcel by parcel, the corrected acreage restored to the record, and the differential value calculated against the original acquisition prices the company had paid. The calculations were not generous to anyone, because the land values of 1865 and the land values of 1887 had little to do with each other, and the court was operating on the basis of the original wrong rather than its subsequent appreciation. Still, the restoration was made. The names in the record were corrected. The plats that bore her uncle's signature now bore the numbers he had actually measured. Nora was not present for most of the proceedings. She had filed her evidence and made herself available to answer the land court's questions, and she had answered them when asked, and beyond that the case ran on its own weight. She found she did not need to watch it run. She had done the part that required her hands. The rest was the work of the institution, which was, in this instance, doing what institutions are supposed to do. She worked that summer in the Bitterroot, taking survey contracts where she could find them. The valley was filling with new homesteaders, and the demand for accurate measurement was real and steady. Word moved through the survey community the way word moves in any small professional world. And by midsummer, she had more contracts than she could complete alone. She hired an assistant, a young man named Pace who had come west from Ohio with some mathematical education and no practical knowledge, and who proved willing to learn the practical part. She taught him what her uncle had taught her, which is to say she taught him to measure things twice, and to trust the second measurement no more automatically than the first. Fenwick, the blacksmith who had bid against her at the auction, stopped her on the road one afternoon in July. He had heard about the documents. He stood at the side of the road with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who is recalibrating something he has been holding in a fixed position for a long time. "I thought you were throwing $6 away," he said. "I know you did," she said. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and went on his way. She went on hers. It was the whole of what needed to be said, and neither of them had any interest in saying more. One of the grandchildren of the original homestead claimants came to see her in September, a woman about her own age named Vera Lund, whose grandmother had held a claim on the north bench above the creek drainage. Lund had traveled from Missoula, where she had been following the land court proceedings, and she arrived at the rooming house where Nora was staying on a weekday evening and knocked and waited. When Nora opened the door, Lund stood there with the straight posture of someone who has come to say something precise and does not intend to take long to say it. "I wanted to find you before the court concluded," Lund said, "to tell you that my grandmother knew the measurement was wrong. She said so when the company took the claim. No one listened to her." "I know," Nora said. Lund nodded. "She died without the record being corrected." "I know that too," Nora said. They stood in the doorway for a moment. There was nothing more that could be done for Vera Lund's grandmother, and both of them knew it, and neither one of them needed to say it. "Thank you for finding it," Lund said, and left. Nora went back inside and sat at the table where her uncle's satchel sat, and the calipers, and the field book for the current survey she was running along the lower valley. The oilcloth was still at the bottom of the satchel. She had considered leaving it at the county office as part of the filed evidence, and had decided against it. It was not evidence. It was the thing that had made the evidence possible. That was a different category, and it belonged to her. The land court closed its proceedings in the spring of 1888. 37 corrected plat entries recorded. The differential acreage acknowledged. The families notified. The matter closed not with any ceremony, but with the same flat administrative acknowledgement that closings in that country always carry. A final notice filed. A file drawer shut. The thing done. Nora heard about it by letter, delivered to a survey camp she was running in the lower valley on a Monday in April. She read the letter standing in the field, at a survey stake she had just driven into the ground along a new homestead boundary, the early spring light coming low across the valley and the pine ridgeline dark to the west. She read it through twice in the manner she read everything that mattered, and then she folded it into the satchel and went back to her measurement. The calipers her uncle had given her were brass and steel, worn smooth at the gripping points where his hand had held them for 22 years before her hand took them. She used them that morning to confirm the boundary stake, measuring the distance from the creek center line to the property corner. And the number was correct, as numbers tend to be when you take the time to measure them honestly and do not allow what you want to be true to interfere with what is. She drove a second stake to anchor the corner, setting it deep enough that it would hold through frost and thaw both. Pace wrote the measurement in his field book. She called out the number a second time and he confirmed it. They moved on to the next station. There is a particular quality to work that is done in the correct way, by the correct person, at the moment when the correct way has finally been made possible. It does not announce itself. It does not require acknowledgement. It simply is what it is, precise and complete, and the measurement stands. If you have ever stood at the edge of what someone else preserved for you to find, you know that the debt runs in a direction you can never fully repay. You can only do the work they left waiting. There are more stories like this one, from different frozen places and different careful hands, and I will tell you another one next time. The oilcloth sat at the bottom of the satchel that evening while the last of the bitterroot April came through the window and the valley settled into dark. It had done its work. It was ready now, for whatever came next. She had not gone back to the creek after that first day. There had been no reason to go back, and she was not a person who returned to the sights of things once the work was done. The work was in the documents, and the documents were in the county office, and the county office was doing what it needed to do. The creek would go on. The wagon would continue its slow dissolution in the water, the wood releasing fiber by fiber into the current, the iron hardware rusting down to a stain on the creek stones. By the time the proceedings in Missoula were complete, there would be nothing left of the bench drawer that would tell anyone it had ever held anything. The evidence of its purpose would be entirely in the record. That was where evidence belonged. What she carried instead was the knowledge of how the thing had felt in her hands when she first lifted it from the drawer, not the intellectual knowledge of what the documents contained, though that too was lodged in her precisely. Each parcel number and its corrected acreage, each family name on Morse's list, the physical knowledge of holding a parcel of papers that had been sealed against time and had survived and had found the right hands at last. There is a weight to that kind of finding. It does not diminish over the months. It settles differently, becomes part of the hand's memory in the way that any significant object eventually does. And she found it with her in the field on quiet mornings when the measurement she was taking required her to be still, and the stillness brought other things up. Her uncle had spent the last years of his life with an incompleteness in him that she had understood only abstractly while he was alive. She had known he carried something that could not be resolved, had felt the weight of it in the particular quality of his silences. But she had been young, and she had understood incompleteness the way young people understand it, as a condition of circumstances rather than a condition of character. She understood it differently now. She understood that he had done everything a careful person could do, and had run out of life before the last step was possible, and that the last step had waited in the ice, and the ice had held it, and the spring had come. The spring always came in that country. That was the one thing you could count on. Winter was fierce and long and conclusive feeling while it lasted, but it did not last. The creek always moved again. The ice always released what it had been holding, one April at a time, until the right April came and the right hands were there to receive what was released. Nora had been the right hands because she was her uncle's hands, trained in the same school, reading the same language of measurement and proportion, carrying the same refusal to let a number be wrong when the right number was knowable. She hadn't known, when she walked into the county record room in March of 1887, that she would follow the thread from the plat discrepancies to her uncle's teaching to the wagon and the drawer and the documents inside. She had simply followed what she knew, one measurement at a time, trusting that careful attention to the dimensions of things would eventually arrive somewhere true. This is what her uncle had taught her. Not the specific steps, not the specific tools, not even the specific insight about the wagon bench, though he had given her that too. He had taught her the posture of a person who believes that the world has fixed dimensions, and that those dimensions are knowable if you are willing to stand in the cold long enough and take the measurement often enough and trust what the numbers say, even when the numbers say something that the powerful would prefer not be said. That posture is not comfortable. It does not make a person popular with those who prefer the recorded figure to the surveyed one. It does not produce quick results. It produces, over time, an understanding of the difference between a thing that is true and a thing that has been written down. And in that difference, when you are patient enough, you can sometimes find the lever that will close the distance between them. She was running a survey in late October of 1888 when Pace brought her a copy of the final land court ruling, which a colleague in Missoula had sent to the Stevensville post office in her care. She read it in the field, at a survey stake on a hill above the valley, with the autumn light going gold across the grass and the mountains to the west already carrying their first snow. The ruling confirmed the corrected plats. It acknowledged the discrepancies as errors of record. It did not use the word fraud in its formal language, which was a limitation of judicial language in the territory at that time, and which she had expected. The corrections were made. The names were corrected. That was what the ruling said, and it was enough. Pace asked if it was good news. She folded the ruling into her satchel and told him the measurement was right, and they should move on to the next station. He had been with her long enough by then to understand that this was a complete answer. He wrote the current measurement in his field book, and they moved on. The valley below was filling with afternoon shadow. The mountains held their light a little longer. She sighted through the instrument to the next station marker and called the measurement, and Pace wrote it down, and she called it again to confirm, and it was correct, as measurements tend to be when they are taken by people who are willing to take them carefully and are not afraid of what they will find. She drove the next stake. The ground was cold already, heading into another bitterroot winter, but the stake went in true.